When you stand on a factory floor watching a red-hot slab of steel pass through heavy milling rollers, the physics involved are massive. To the naked eye, that metal looks like a continuous, uniform solid. But if we zoom in to the microscopic level, we find a completely different landscape. Millions of distinct, interlocking crystal lattices tightly packed together. This diagram on the left illustrates the reality of physical chaos. Inside the metal, each individual grain sits at its own random geometric angle. To predict how a sheet of metal will behave when we bend it or stretch it, we have to find a way to mathematically capture and organize this chaotic spread of crystal orientations. We can't measure anything until we establish a fixed frame of reference. We need a coordinate system that links the internal geometry of those microscopic crystals directly to the macroscopic dimensions of the physical sheet. This schematic outlines the three primary reference axes of any rolled sheet. We track the rolling direction, or RD, the transverse direction, or TD, across the width, and the normal direction, or ND, which sits strictly perpendicular to the surface. Locking down these three rigid external axes is the required first step in translating physical observations into usable engineering data. Once the specimen axes are set, metallurgists describe a crystal's internal geometry using Miller indices. That is the HKL UVW notation shown here. The HKL component identifies the specific crystal plane sitting strictly parallel to the specimen surface. Mathematically, this aligns with the normal direction. The UVW component defines the crystal direction pointing straight along the axes of physical deformation, the rolling direction. Notice that the transverse direction is missing from the notation. Because the axes are orthogonal, defining two directions automatically locks the third spatial axis into place. Miller indices are highly intuitive for humans trying to visualize crystal geometry relative to a physical sample. But when we feed this notation into a computer, it causes a problem. As this diagram shows, physical bracket notation creates a computational roadblock. It is mathematically cumbersome and entirely inefficient for calculating the complex spatial distributions required by modeling software. We have to build a mathematical bridge to convert these physical variables into a continuous numerical format. Moving from a physical description to predictive structural modeling requires us to trade visual intuition for rigorous computational structure. That structure is the orthogonal rotation matrix, denoted here by a lowercase g. It serves as the numerical engine capable of translating coordinates from the crystal frame to the specimen frame. For high-symmetry materials like cubic metals, we construct this 3x3 matrix by pulling data directly from our physical measurements. This formula represents the fully populated mathematical destination, a 9-element array. The values in the first column are extracted directly from the UVW Miller indices, representing the specimen's rolling direction. To maintain mathematical integrity, we divide these raw values by a constant, n1, ensuring the vector is properly normalized. The third column pulls directly from the HKL indices to represent the normal direction, and is similarly normalized by the constant n3. These two outer columns now hold the exact mathematical equivalence of the surface and rolling directions. But the matrix is incomplete. We need a middle column to represent the transverse direction, a value we did not explicitly measure. Mapping the explicit physical dimensions gets us 2/3 to a full model. To finalize the transformation, we must generate the missing middle column computationally. Because the physical axes sit perpendicular, we derive the final mathematical axes without new measurements. We calculate a vector cross product. Multiplying normal by rolling direction automatically generates the transverse direction. This derived vector perfectly slots into the center column, completing our matrix. Locking down all three internal coordinates is a strict requirement for many manufacturing techniques, but it isn't necessary for every application. This breaks down the distinction between biaxial and uniaxial textures. Biaxial texture tightly aligns two crystal axes with the specimen coordinates, required for bulk metal rolling. Uniaxial texture aligns only one physical axis, leaving the crystal plane to rotate randomly, common in thin films. However, advanced functional materials, like high-temperature superconductor thin films, break this rule. They demand strict multidirectional biaxial alignment to operate correctly. By calculating the complete rotation matrix, we generate an exact numerical mirror of a biaxially formed metal, capturing its specific three-dimensional physical constraints inside the software. At this point, we hit a visualization roadblock. A 9-element matrix is perfect for a computer executing back-end calculations, but a human engineer physically cannot plot 9 spatial dimensions on a graph. We need a method to compress those 9 distinct numbers into a coordinate format that we can actually visualize in 3-dimensional space. This chart illustrates the mathematical solution. We decompose the full rotation matrix into Euler angles. Euler angles define a sequence of 3 independent specific rotations, phi1, capital Phi, and phi2. Executing these angular shifts achieves the exact same alignment as the full matrix. By applying these 3 precise twists in sequence, we perfectly align the macroscopic specimen frame with the internal crystal lattice. These 3 sequential angles output a single, unified set of 3 coordinates, representing that specific crystal's alignment. This coordinate set is the final computational output. It is the exact variable needed by materials scientists to begin analyzing large datasets. Euler decomposition bridges the gap between machine computation and human analysis, compressing 9 dimensions of math into a single, highly accurate data point that we can plot. This data pipeline leads to a single destination, 3D orientation space. This is the environment where statistical modeling takes place. In applied engineering, millions of initial physical crystallites are mapped and processed through this pipeline simultaneously. The graph on the right displays the final result. The impenetrable physical chaos of the metal is translated into clean, distinct point clouds floating within a 3-dimensional coordinate graph. As these data points cluster together, complex material behaviors emerge as quantifiable groups. Engineers classify these as specific texture components, such as the cube, brass, or Gauss components. Knowing exactly where these clusters lie allows engineers to predict physical anisotropy, determining how a metal will deform, yield, or break under massive industrial pressure. Extracting this level of statistical precision is completely impossible if we attempt to rely solely on the initial physical Miller indices. We start with raw physical geometry, process it through the rigorous numerical bridge of a rotation matrix, and compress it down into highly readable Euler orientation space. Mastering this mathematical translation is the fundamental prerequisite for designing, controlling, and manufacturing the next generation of advanced functional materials.